We're here at Simon Lee Gallery with Toby Ziegler to talk about his new exhibition, Post-Human Paradise, and the inspiration he has drawn from Matisse's large reclining nude. Your starting point for this series of works is Matisse's large reclining nude. What is it that particularly draws you to this painting?
I think it was a kind of postcard classic of the 80s, and I think there was probably one like sellotaped to my mum and dad's bathroom wall. And when I first, as a sort of teenager, got excited about painting, I think Matisse was definitely an entry point. But then, I suppose, haven't looked at him so much in recent years. But then when I went back to see that show, the paper cutout show at the Tate, I was kind of amazed at the fact that this was his response to the war. Like he was tucked away in Vichy, France, in the south of France with his assistants, like cutting out these highly coloured bits of paper and making something so like unapologetically beautiful. And I found that quite incongruous, but fascinating. And then I suppose I've been working for a while. There's a film in the show. This is a kind of introduction to the show, which is this 2-screen sort of animation, really, I suppose. And I made 12 versions of the Matisse painting, starting very figurative and then just reducing the resolution on Photoshop until you end up with something that's almost a monochrome. And those 12 images I then fed into Google reverse image search, which is when, rather than using text to find images, you put an image in, and if Google can't find the original image, it will try and calculate using an algorithm and find similar images. And every time I reduced the resolution, the results differed dramatically. And somehow, for quite a while, I've been interested in this idea of thinking about the body in relationship to digital technology, and also, I suppose, the history of painting in relation to that, the way we receive images nowadays, and the way that images get circulated and the way they kind of lose resolution in many ways, sort of metaphorically as well, things that become almost sort of invisible, or they just become a thumbnail, and I think in a similar way to a postcard on your mum and dad's kitchen cupboard, those sort of images that you're so familiar with that they become almost invisible. But that image, as well as feeling like it worked in relation to that kind of loss of narrative, it also just did something very interesting when I searched for it on Google. So I just searched for it one day, and came back with 16 results or whatever, and they're all slightly different hues and all slightly different. Some of them are cropped and some of them are stretched, and it just tessellated in an interesting way. It became very graphic, and I suppose the fact that it already had a grid in it, the painting's got like grids of tiles, I think, behind the figure, but within the grid of Google, it just was visually very compelling, this sort of grid of grids, which I suppose also sort of has a relationship with the digital. So I lived with it for quite a while. I started playing around with files on the computer and thought it would be an interesting thing to work from, but somewhere in the back of my mind also it felt familiar somehow, this grid of the Matisse paintings repeated. And then at some point I remembered that actually in a book that I'd had since I was 13, there was this grid of photographs that he had taken of the evolution of that particular painting. So it starts off in the sort of top left-hand corner as a really quite figurative, quite illusionistic space with a much more modelled figure. And then he gradually works on it and distorts it and moves the head around, and he's sticking bits of paper on top of the canvas and trying out different permutations. And gradually the figure gets flatter and flatter, and the space gets less deep, and you end up with something that's, yeah, much more stylized. So I felt that was kind of serendipitous or something. It felt like that was another narrative that echoed exactly what I was interested in, this kind of loss of the figure and the loss of an image. And I suppose this kind of line that painting often walks, or you could say it always does in a way, where you can look at it as a completely abstract composition. There's a great quote, I think from Frank Stella, but saying that if you squint in front of a Rubens, you get Jackson Pollock. And I suppose I've always loved it when paintings do fall apart and you have to negotiate them as something totally abstract. So this felt like, you know, the Google search was doing that in one way, and then his own documentation was doing it in another way. But then the way that I approach making paintings at the moment also very much follows that logic in a slightly different way. But I spend quite a while painting the original image, so it might be the page of 16 Matisses that I found off Google, sort of painting it quite slowly and quite painstakingly, sort of mixing colours and trying to create something that's quite faithful to the original image. And then that might take a month. And then after that I sprayed a layer of paint on top of these paintings, or some of them I painted with a large brush. So I wanted to have something that was much quicker and much more gestural. And then finally came back in with an electric sander and started to take it all off again. And it's quite terrifying, really, because I actually almost got the whole show like 90% ready. So all of the paintings had been worked on for a long time, but nothing was finished. And then I sanded everything back in the last month. And everything changed a lot, actually, even in the last 2 weeks. And it's a big unknown what you're going to get to some extent. And it's a kind of perverse way of trying to make a mark, I suppose, in a way. Like, I think on leaving art school, I really kind of felt quite disillusioned with painting and was struggling to find a way to feel like I could justify it or find my own way with it. It felt like there was a kind of real burden of cliches, of kind of the legacy of quite macho history, and I think as a result I ended up doing things that were very kind of schematic. And then it's only really through working with computers and working through these very, very sort of painstaking, quite laborious process that I kind of found I was able to find a way to use that as a foil in a way, to make a gesture again. And I suppose in a way that now those two parts of the process are quite polarized. So I spend a long time preparing the paintings, and they're painted on these aluminium panels, and then, you know, half an hour you can undo an entire month's work. So kind of sanding back through the spray paint and then revealing the image underneath, and then sanding through that to reveal the aluminium under that. So you end up with this kind of slightly geological kind of exploration.
So did all of the paintings in the show start off the same?
They all come from the Matisse image. A couple of them are just a single image of it, and then the rest of them are different scales and crops of Google searches. So you end up with, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous in a way as a subject matter for a painting, but to have a Google search of like paintings. But yeah, so a lot of them, they're tiled. You can see 16 versions or more or less miniature versions of the Matisse painting that just come from a screen grab from Google. And I inverted the colours on some of them, because that's one of the ways that I kind of explore things on Google Images. If you just if you use the original image, it will come back with the Matisse painting. Whereas if you just invert the colours, then it won't recognise it. Or if you invert the tone and then invert the colours, you end up, actually, you invert the image so you get a negative, but then you reverse the colours again. So you end up with the original colours, but just kind of inverted tonally. So then you end up with something that looks uncannily like the original image, but Google still can't recognise it. And so that's when it gets quite interesting, the sort of results it throws up, because it sort of becomes associative, really. It sort of tells you what the users of Google, the kind of hive brain of the internet, associate with a set of colours or tones. And as you change, I mean, I've done quite a few experiments over the last few years with this reverse image search thing. As you slowly change the colours, the results change completely, and so it'll go from like children's toys. And obviously it's also extraordinary how gendered it becomes, because it's pink nude, and because it's, even if they're very kind of exaggerated flesh tones, you get sometimes like super visceral sort of details of people's cold sores or their cankers, and a lot of dentistry, and then I suppose what you really learn maybe isn't about some kind of great communal subconscious exactly, but more about what people look at on Google.
So the film that you've made, is that using these images that you got given back from Google?
Exactly. So it's just 12, on the top screen you have 12 images of the Matisse painting, being slowly reduced in resolution, going from figurative to monochrome. And underneath you have the 12 corresponding Google pages that come back when you feed those images through the similar image search.
So these were all just things that Google threw back at you?
Yeah, so you can see the top image is like slowly getting sharper now.
So that's what you were feeding in?
Exactly, and these are what Google
gave back to you from that?
Exactly. And it's interesting the way it becomes really kind of corporeal at one point, in the middle when it's quite blurred. The other thing that's interesting is the technology keeps changing. So the kind of results I was getting 2 years ago when I first started doing these sort of Google searches were very different.
Really?
But now it's getting more and more intelligent.
Yeah.
And the way that it's able to read images is getting more and more sophisticated. So it can differentiate between a photographed image and a drawn image.
Okay.
Or it can differentiate between like graphics, something with type in it, or it can recognize faces. It can differentiate between like black and white photographs and color, but I've been kind of testing the parameters of it. And obviously the things where it's interesting is when it doesn't recognize an image. It's like when you can find the kind of the holes in the system.
Yeah.
But it's scary how quickly it's moving, but also really interesting where it does fall down. Like there've been some quite big news stories about where image recognition software has got things poignantly wrong, like sort of in racist ways, misidentifying people as like animals, or like there was, or like once it decided that Auschwitz was a adventure playground, you know, it was sort of like auto-tagging goes really wrong in quite dramatic ways.
Yeah.
I think when I install a show, they almost always become, for me, a real group of works that somehow function as a whole. Even though they end up being split apart, they often do feel kind of like words in a sentence. And to some extent, I was conscious of there being bookends for the show, like the first painting in the show and the last painting in the show are the ones that have been sanded back least. So the image is more legible, and I kind of wanted to give people a way in. And so you start with something that's really quite, the colours have been modified and the way it's been handled has changed a lot. The scale has changed and it's been sprayed on top of, but you can definitely read the Matisse painting. And then the last painting that you come to, similarly, is a Google search of the painting where you can quite clearly see 16 little versions of it. And I think I wanted it to kind of fall apart in the middle and then coalesce back into something figurative at the end.